Picture a block of wood in your hands. It's a deep, rich, chocolate brown, shot through with these yellowish red and almost black streaks.
And it feels incredibly smooth, right?
Exactly. The surface is so smooth it feels cold. Like it feels almost like holding a piece of polished marble rather than actual timber.
It's surprisingly heavy, too.
Yeah, and that's the crazy part. Now, I want you to imagine taking that block of wood and dropping it into a bucket of water.
Which is where things get weird.
Right, because it doesn't bob to the surface. I mean, it doesn't float at all. It plunges straight to the bottom and stays there. It sinks like a literal brick.
Which totally shatters our fundamental understanding of what plant matter is supposed to do.
Seriously.
We are so conditioned to think of wood as buoyant, pliable, temporary. The material you're describing behaves way more like industrial metallurgy than biology.
It really does. And to prove that, imagine taking that same piece of wood and running it through an industrial table saw.
Yeah.
Instead of a clean cut, the steel blade of the saw catches, overheats, and literally shatters.
It's unbelievable.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are focusing all our attention on a single astonishing organism, the desert ironwood, or Olnea tesora.
A fantastic subject.
And our mission today is to understand how this tree fundamentally breaks the rules of nature. To do that, we're pulling from a massive stack of wildly diverse material. I'm talking commercial woodworking databases, governmental ecological warnings, indigenous histories, and even modern conservation reports.
It takes a lot of different lenses to really grasp what this plant is doing.
Absolutely. Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to imagine standing in the absolute center of the Sonoran Desert. The heat is shimmering off the rocks. The air is so dry, it just pulls the moisture straight out of your lungs.
Survival in that environment is definitely not a given.
No, not at all. It requires radical, almost alien evolutionary trade-offs.
Because the Sonoran Desert is basically an evolutionary crucible.
Yeah.
And the ironwood is not just a participant in that environment. I mean, it is the architectural keystone of the entire ecosystem.
The anchor.
Right. It's this evolutionary marvel that anchors the biology of the desert. And as we'll see, it also served as the cultural anchor for a fiercely independent, unconquered people for centuries.
But to really understand its ecological or, human impact, we have to start with the physics of the organism itself.
Yeah, the sheer physical impossibility of the wood.
Let's get into that. Because when you dive into the commercial woodworking data, the numbers they don't make sense for a living thing. Let's look at specific gravity.
A great place to start.
For you listening, specific gravity is basically a measurement of density compared to water. So water has a specific gravity of 1.0.
And most wood sits well below that, right?
Exactly. Most wood is around 0.4 to 0.6, which is why boats float. But the wood of the desert ironwood has a basic specific gravity of 0.97 while it's still alive.
Which is already basically sinking.
Right. But when it dries, that number rises to roughly 1.21.
Because it condenses as the minimal moisture it holds evaporates, it just draws the cellular structure even tighter together.
Yeah, and it reaches an average dried weight of 75 pounds per cubic foot.
Wow.
I mean, a cubic foot of water is about 62 pounds, so it is vastly heavier than the water it displaces.
It's essentially a rock at that point.
Pretty much. And then you look at the hardness scale. Woodworkers rely on the Janka hardness rating, which is the international standard for measuring how resistant a wood is to denting and wear.
And the test for that is incredibly specific.
Very. They take an 11.28 millimeter steel ball, which is nearly half an inch thick, and they measure the exact pounds of force required to embed that steel ball halfway into the sample.
It is a brutal test of structural integrity.
It really is. To give you a benchmark, think about red oak. Red oak is the gold standard for residential hardwood floors in the U.S.
Sure.
You can walk on it every day, drop pots and pans on it, let dogs run across it for a century, and it totally holds up. Embedding that steel ball into red oak takes 12,290 pounds of force.
Okay, so that's the baseline.
Right. But the desert ironwood, it requires 3,260 pounds of force.
That is just wild.
It's 152.71% harder than the floor you're likely standing on right now.
And the structural yield point is equally fascinating.
Oh, the modulus of rupture.
Yeah, the absolute limit of stress the wood can take before the fibers just catastrophically snap. It measures 10,880 pounds of force per square inch. I mean, it's essentially a biological fortress.
But wait, this is where I need to push back a little.
Okay, go for it.
Because evolutionarily, this doesn't make any sense to me. Building biological armor this dense requires a staggering amount of energy and carbon.
It's a huge metabolic investment, yes.
Right. If I'm a plant living in a desert where water is practically a rumor, My primary goal should be to gather whatever scarce resources I can find and reproduce as quickly as possible before I die.
That's the standard strategy.
So why would a tree waste its severely limited metabolic energy building armor that breaks steel instead of just, I don't know, growing faster or producing more seeds? It feels like a massive misallocation of resources.
Well, that assumes the ironwood is playing the same game as other plants.
It isn't.
It isn't. You have to look at the defining constraint of the Sonoran Desert, which is an agonizing lack of water.
Right. The sources say the region receives anywhere from a meager 75 to 400 millimeters of annual rainfall.
Exactly. Now, most plants in temperate climates grow by opening up the pores on their leaves, the stomata, absorbing massive amounts of carbon dioxide, and engaging in heavy, rapid photosynthesis.
Okay.
And as they do this, they rapidly expand their cellular walls, stretching upward to outcompete their neighbors for sunlight.
But opening those pores in the desert comes with a lethal cost.
It's physiological suicide. When a plant opens its stomata to take in carbon dioxide, water naturally escapes through transpiration.
Oh, wow. So in the baking heat of the Sonoran Desert, rapid photosynthesis would basically mean venting all of its internal moisture to the atmosphere in a matter of hours.
Precisely. The ironwood absolutely refuses to do that. It adopts a strategy of extreme metabolic conservatism.
Meaning it just shuts down.
Pretty much. It utilizes an incredibly low photosynthetic capacity, opening its pores just enough to sustain itself. It is absolutely prioritizing the retention of precious soil moisture over growth.
So it's basically holding its breath for hundreds of years.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. Because its metabolism is so slow, its growth is glacial.
How slow are we talking?
We're looking at a tree that might only reach 20 to 30 feet tall after several centuries.
Wow. Centuries.
Yeah, and here's the mechanical answer to your question about its density. Because the growth is so slow, it doesn't build those large, airy, water-filled cells you see in fast-growing trees like pine or oak.
Oh, I see.
It accumulates biomass with almost zero cell spacing. The plant cells are packed together microscopically tight.
So it's not actively trying to build armor. The armor is just a byproduct of refusing to expand its cells and lose water.
The density is the architectural result of patience.
That is poetic.
But the tree takes it a step further chemically. As it slowly packs these cells together, it saturates the heartwood with highly toxic organic compounds and natural heavy oils.
Chemical warfare against the desert.
Essentially, yeah. The oils and compounds serve a dual purpose. They prevent whatever trace moisture is left inside the heartwood from evaporating, and they make the wood entirely hostile to biological attackers.
Like insects and stuff.
Right. Termites, beetles, fungal spores. The organisms that typically break down dead plant matter, they just cannot penetrate or digest the ironwood. The extractives are just too toxic to them.
Which leads to an incredible localized immortality.
It really does outlast everything.
When an ironwood tree finally dies, say, after living for 800 years, it doesn't rot. It doesn't return to the soil in a few seasons like a normal tree. A dead trunk can stand perfectly intact in the brutal desert sun, sandblasted by the wind for up to 1,600 years.
It really requires a paradigm shift in how we view the life cycle of a forest. The quote-unquote dead wood is a permanent fixture of the geography. It outlasts the rise and fall of whole human civilizations.
Which sets up this incredible biological paradox.
How so?
Well, because everything we've just discussed paints the ironwood as this isolated, heavily armored, toxic, indestructible hermit of a plant.
That's a fair assessment.
It seems perfectly designed to shut the world out and just survive in solitary confinement. But the ecological data from the Ironwood Forest National Monument reveals the exact opposite.
Ah, yes.
This solitary fortress is actually the nurturing lifeblood of the entire ecosystem.
It is the ultimate biological irony. The toughest, most unyielding entity in the desert is categorized by botanists as a nurse plant.
Let's break down the mechanics of a nurse plant. How does an armored tree nurse anything?
It all comes down to the microclimate generated by its canopy.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Yeah. Because the ironwood's leaves are tightly packed, again, a result of that slow, dense growth strategy we talked about, and because it's nearly evergreen, it creates a very specific thermal zone beneath its branches.
And the Sonoran Desert is definitely an environment of wild temperature extremes.
Right. During a summer day, the exposed soil can reach temperatures that literally bake seedlings alive. But beneath the dense canopy of the ironwood, the ground is significantly shaded and cooler.
So it acts as an umbrella blocking the direct solar radiation.
Exactly. And in the winter, the mechanism reverses. The desert floor gets incredibly cold at night, frequently dropping below freezing.
Because there's no cloud cover to trap the heat.
Right. The soil absorbs heat during the day and radiates it back into the atmosphere at night, but the dense canopy of the ironwood traps that long-wave radiation, reflecting it back down and creating a thermal blanket over the soil directly beneath it.
So it's literally a localized HVAC system. It cools the ground in the summer and heats it in the winter.
It's a critical stabilization of the environment. And the number of species that exploit this thermal stabilization is staggering.
Let's talk about the saguaro cactus.
Oh, perfect example.
Yeah.
The iconic, multi-armed giant of the Southwest.
The classic cactus from every old Western movie you've ever seen.
Yeah, that one. Giant adult saguaros are robust, obviously. But a seedling saguaro is incredibly fragile.
Why is that?
They are highly vulnerable to freezing temperatures. The cellular structure of a young cactus is mostly water. So if it freezes, ice crystals form inside the cells, puncturing the cell walls and turning the plant to mush when it thaws.
Oh, man. So a sudden frost is a mass extinction event for young cacti.
Entirely. Unless they happen to take root under the thermal blanket of a desert ironwood.
That's amazing.
The tree physically shelters them through their most vulnerable decades, but the reliance goes far beyond cacti.
What else relies on it?
The massive, ancient root systems of the ironwood create stable soil structures, which provides essential burrowing sites for desert tortoises.
Oh, nice.
And the sturdy, dense branches offer safe roosting for red-tailed hawks and great horned owls. And then, in the late spring, the tree erupts in pink and lavender flowers.
Which provides a massive influx of pollen and nectar critical for native solitary bees.
Right.
The biodiversity numbers are mind-blowing. In the Silver Bell Mountains alone, the specific habitat created by the ironwood and the bursage plant supports over 674 different species.
It's an oasis.
I mean, we are talking about 64 mammalian species and 57 bird species, all orbiting around the localized microclimate of this single tree.
It operates as an island of habitability. Without the ironwood acting as a thermodynamic buffer, the extreme temperature swings of the desert would just scour these vulnerable species from the landscape entirely.
And the tree's relationship with temperature is so precise that humans historically used it as a biological tool.
Yeah, our research on agricultural history points out that the ironwood actually acts as a living thermometer.
This is a beautiful example of humans reading the landscape.
It really is. Because despite its dense armor and toxicity, the ironwood does have a singular Achilles heel, and that's severe cold.
Okay, what happens when it gets cold?
If the ambient temperature drops to -6 degrees Celsius, the ironwood sustains catastrophic stem damage. It simply cannot survive sustained deep freezes.
So if you see a giant 800-year-old ironwood tree,
You know with absolute certainty that the specific microvalley or hillside where it grows has never dropped below -6 degrees Celsius for 8 centuries.
wow, that is an incredibly specific weather record.
Historically, agriculturalists moving into the region use this to their advantage. They wanted to plant citrus crops, which are highly lucrative but notoriously vulnerable to freezing.
Right, a bad frost destroys an orange grove.
Exactly. So instead of relying on guesswork or short-term weather data, they used the wild ironwoods as indicator plants. Finding an ancient ironwood grove meant finding a guaranteed freeze-free safe zone for vulnerable citrus.
They used a millennia-old organism as incredibly accurate climate data.
It's brilliant.
It really is. When you step back and look at the whole picture, the hawks, the tortoises, the saguaros, the bees, you realize the entire desert ecosystem is basically a towering house of cards. And the ironwood is the heavy, indestructible table that the whole house is built on.
Pull the table away and the ecosystem collapses.
A textbook keystone species.
So what does this all mean? We see how the flora and fauna desperately rely on this tree,
But the human element is where this story shifts into high gear.
Oh, absolutely.
Because humans had to figure out how to survive in this exact same furnace of a landscape.
Which brings us to the Seri people.
Right. And an indigenous group who refer to themselves as the Comcaac. The Comcaac are historically a nomadic hunter-gatherer society native to the harsh Sonoran coast and Tiburon Island in the Gulf of California.
A fascinating culture.
And when you look at their history, the first thing that demands attention is their fierce absolute independence. I mean, they were never formally conquered.
Their history of resistance is unique in the timeline of the Americas.
How so?
Well, during the colonial era, the Spanish conquistadors swept across the continent, systematically subjugating indigenous populations, establishing mission systems, and extracting wealth through forced labor.
The usual colonial playbook.
Right. But the Comcaac remained entirely outside the system of subjugation.
And while they were formidable warriors who fiercely defended their territory, their ultimate shield against the Spanish was actually economics.
Yes, the Spanish Empire operated on a very specific spreadsheet of colonial extraction.
Ah, the encomienda system.
Exactly. That system relied on capturing arable land and forcing the local sedentary populations to farm it, basically generating agricultural wealth for the crown.
But you look at the Comcaac territory, the unforgiving coastal Sonoran Desert, and there is zero arable land by European agricultural standards.
You can't plant wheat or corn in burning sand.
Exactly. Furthermore, the Comcaac were nomadic. They moved fluidly with the seasons and the available water sources.
They didn't build permanent stone cities.
No. They didn't hoard stockpiles of gold, and they didn't have accumulated material wealth that could be plundered.
So from the perspective of the Spanish military, attempting to conquer the Comcaac meant financing massively expensive military expeditions into a deadly desert.
Only to capture territory that yielded zero profit.
Right. Populated by people who couldn't be forced into agricultural slavery because there was no agriculture to perform.
The Spanish literally ran the numbers and decided conquering the Comcaac was a bad return on investment.
The hostility of the desert was their ultimate defense. It allowed them to maintain their cultural autonomy and linguistic independence far longer than almost any other indigenous group in the region.
That's incredible. But surviving in a landscape that actively repelled European armies required an intimate, highly evolved understanding of the environment.
They had to be brilliant adapters.
The Comcaac developed survival strategies that blur the line between desert and marine biology. For example, I was reading, they're the only known indigenous people on the planet to have harvested Zostera marina.
A type of marine eelgrass.
Yeah, for its nutritional seeds. They were harvesting grain from the ocean floor. That is mind-blowing.
It shows how perfectly they integrated with both the desert and the sea.
And because they lived in an environment where resource scarcity was the baseline, they couldn't afford a society built on individual hoarding. If one family hoards food while another starves, the whole tribe eventually weakens and dies.
So they hardwired sharing into their cultural DNA.
Right. They engineered robust social safety nets.
Two specific kinship systems really highlight this adaptation to scarcity.
Oh, let's talk about those.
The first is called quimosim. This dictates that any member of the community has the absolute right to ask for and receive a portion of the food currently being consumed by others.
Just without needing an invitation.
Right, without needing an invitation.
So there is no concept of this is my dinner.
Mm,
If someone is eating, the community is eating.
exactly. The second system is canoa and hauntquit, which applies specifically to their maritime hunting. It is the right to ask for a portion of the catch from any returning fishing boat.
Even if you had nothing to do with the hunt.
Yeah, you didn't have to help build the boat, you didn't have to be on the crew, and you didn't have to catch the fish. If the ocean yielded food to the hunters, that food belonged to the community.
It is a profound system of mutual survival. But this brings me back to the ironwood tree.
Okay, let's connect the dots.
The Comcaac used whatever the environment provided, obviously. But we just established that the ironwood breaks steel saws and is packed with toxic chemicals. How does a nomadic society with traditional tools utilize a tree that hostile?
Well, it requires immense ethnobotanical mastery. The Comcaac didn't fight the nature of the wood. They leveraged its extremes.
How so?
They stripped the bark and boiled it to create medicinal teas for gastric ailments. When they needed tools that required exceptional weight and durability, like the heavy tips of harpoons used for hunting sea turtles, they spent the arduous hours necessary to shape the ironwood.
Because it would sink and strike hard.
Precisely.
But the most shocking interaction isn't the harpoons, it's the seeds. They ate the seeds. But wait, didn't you just say the tree engages in chemical warfare against herbivores?
I did, and this is where human ingenuity is on full display. The ironwood seeds are packed with a compound called canaverin.
Let's get into the mechanics of canaverin. How does it work?
Canaverin is an arginine analog.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
Arginine is a standard amino acid that animals use to build proteins in their bodies. An analog is basically a chemical imposter.
So it fakes it.
Right. It looks and behaves structurally similar to arginine. When an herbivore, say a desert rodent, eats the ironwood seeds, its body absorbs the canaverin and accidentally tries to use it in place of arginine during protein synthesis.
Oh, wow. It inserts a fake building block into the animal's cellular construction,
Exactly, the biological mechanism at play. Because the building block is slightly wrong, the resulting proteins misfold. They become defective.
which has to be bad news for the rodent.
Oh, it is. This disrupts the animal's biology, causing severe illness or death. It is a brilliant evolutionary defense mechanism by the tree to ensure its seeds aren't eaten.
But the Comcaac found a chemical workaround. How do you defeat an amino acid imposter with a campfire in a clay pot?
You utilize heat and solubility. The Comcaac discovered that canaverin is water-soluble and breaks down under sustained heat.
Okay.
They would gather the seeds, boil them in water, and then carefully discard that toxic water. Then they would add fresh water and boil the seeds a second time to ensure every trace of the analog was leached out and denatured.
A double boil chemical extraction.
What remained was a completely safe, highly nutritious, protein-dense food source. Anthropologists who've studied their diet actually note that the processed seeds taste remarkably similar to soybeans or roasted peanuts.
No way. They took a toxic, armor-plated tree and turned it into medicine, harpoons, and peanut butter.
The adaptability is truly staggering.
But as we follow the timeline into the modern era, the relationship between the Comcaac and the ironwood changes drastically. It shifts from ancient survival into the realm of global commercial art.
And that transition brings a massive wave of tragic consequences.
Here's where it gets really interesting, folks. The birth of ironwood art.
The modern ironwood carving industry has an origin story rooted in ecological and economic disruption.
Set the scene for us.
In the 1960s, the traditional economy of the Comcaac was fracturing. Commercial shrimping and large-scale fishing operations from outside fleets were heavily depleting their traditional maritime food sources in the Gulf of California.
So they were being outcompeted for their own resources by industrial boats.
Exactly. Simultaneously, infrastructure improvements were bringing an influx of American and Mexican tourists into areas like Quino Bay.
And someone saw an opportunity.
Yes, a Seri man named Jose Astorga recognized this shifting dynamic. He began carving small utilitarian items out of palo fierro, the desert ironwood.
And eventually, he moved to carving the animals he knew intimately from his life on the coast, right? Sea turtles, dolphins, and pelicans.
And he sold these to the tourists.
And the original traditional method of creating these carvings was an absolute labor of love. I mean, they weren't cutting down live trees.
Culturally and practically, that made absolutely no sense. Live ironwood is heavy with moisture and prone to cracking as it cures.
Right.
The traditional Seri carvers would venture deep into the desert to locate the ancient, already dead wood. The trees that had stood dead in the sun for centuries, perfectly dried and cured by the elements.
And their toolkit was incredibly basic. They would use an axe to rough out the general shape of a turtle or dolphin.
Right, just getting the rough block.
And lacking modern machinery to deal with that 200-pound Jenga hardness, they relied on rasps or coarse files. To achieve the final glass-like smoothness that the carvings are famous for, they literally scraped the wood with shards of broken glass.
Imagine the time that took.
Days. And then they polished it by hand using abrasive desert sand and sealed it with natural turtle fat. Though I read they later adapted to using commercial shoe polish.
It was a painstaking, intimate, artistic process, and the resulting art pieces were undeniably beautiful.
The tourists bought them up instantly. The carvings became a huge sensation. But here is the twist. They became far too popular.
The market demand vastly outpaced what a few dozen artisans working with broken glass and desert sand could produce.
By the 1970s and 1980s, the Mexican government began actively promoting Sonoran crafts. Non-Seri populations in the surrounding cities saw the immense profit potential.
But they had no interest in spending 3 days hand-sanding a single dolphin.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
They wanted volume and efficiency, so they industrialized the process.
They brought in the power tools?
Bandsaws, high-speed electric sanders, commercial buffing wheels. Suddenly, warehouses in Sonora were mass-producing these carvings by the thousands, just flooding the tourist markets across the border.
The immediate fallout was economic displacement. The Seri people were entirely priced out of their own cultural invention.
That's devastating.
Today, the data indicates that fewer than 15 traditional Seri carvers remain active. The market is overwhelmingly dominated by non-indigenous, mass-produced pieces, many of which are deceptively labeled with "handmade by Seri" stickers just to maintain the romantic illusion for tourists.
The economic theft is heartbreaking, but the tragedy goes beyond money. It becomes a major health crisis for the people running those power tools.
Yeah, this is where the biology of the wood fights back.
Remember the toxic extractives and the extreme density we talked about. When a traditional carver uses a hand file, the wood comes off in heavy, slow shavings that just fall to the floor.
But when you hit a piece of desert ironwood with a 3,000 RPM electric bandsaw,
You aerosolize the tree's chemical defenses.
you turn it into toxic dust.
The industrial woodworking data we pulled paints a terrifying picture of what happens in these mass production shops. The dust of the desert ironwood is laced with silica.
Those are tiny, glass-like particles that the tree pulls from the desert soil.
Right. When the workers inhale that fine dust, the silica settles deep into their lungs. The body can't clear it, so it builds scar tissue around the particles.
Which leads to silicosis.
Exactly. An incurable progressive lung disease that mimics the symptoms of black lung in coal miners.
Furthermore, the aerosolized natural oils and toxic organic compounds act as severe irritants and allergens.
The woodworking forums are full of horror stories from modern woodworkers about this. Breathing the dust causes violent respiratory distress, sneezing fits, and even lethal fungal lung infections if the wood was carrying spores.
And the dust literally stains the worker's skin purple.
Purple. And on top of the chemical hazard, the wood is so dense and brittle that if a power tool catches a flaw, the wood shatters like shrapnel. One woodworker documented getting a bloody nose instantly just from a flying fragment of ironwood snapping off a lathe.
It just underscores a crucial reality. The material is fundamentally antagonistic to industrial mass production. It exacts a real physical toll on the human body when forced into a high-speed manufacturing process.
There is an incredible anecdote in the sources about the sheer physical presence of this wood. A tourist bought a beautiful heavy ironwood bear carving in Mexico and tried to bring it back in their carry-on luggage.
Okay, what happened?
When they went through airport security, the TSA confiscated it.
Because of the edges?
No. They didn't confiscate it because it had sharp edges. They confiscated it because the wood is so exceptionally dense that security classified the carving as a literal bludgeon.
Wow.
It was a wooden weapon.
It perfectly illustrates the extremity of the material. A piece of art classified as a blunt force weapon by virtue of its biological density alone.
So we've covered the existential threats facing the traditional artisans, but now we have to face the threats to the tree itself. How does a tree that evolved to outlast empires, a tree that survives extreme drought and totally defies rot, suddenly face the threat of outright erasure?
Well, the vulnerability lies in the collision between slow-motion biology and hyper-accelerated human exploitation. Let's look at the harvesting numbers prior to the implementation of governmental protections.
Okay.
In 1992 alone, an estimated 21,000 tons of desert ironwood were harvested in Mexico.
21,000 tons
Yeah.
of a tree that takes 500 years to reach the size of a standard oak. That is staggering.
And it wasn't even being used for art. The vast majority of those 21,000 tons were converted into charcoal.
Charcoal.
Over 90% of that charcoal was exported across the border to the United States, destined for high-end steakhouses and mesquite barbecues. Because the wood is so dense and packed with oils, it burns incredibly hot and long, making it a premium cooking fuel.
We were incinerating half-millennium-old keystone species to grill steaks. That is so grim.
The Mexican government did recognize the impending ecological collapse, and they officially protected the living trees in 1994.
But enforcement has to be tough.
Very. Enforcement in the vast remote desert is incredibly difficult. Illegal woodcutting continues to this day, driven by the persistent demand for charcoal and carving wood. Studies show that in certain heavily poached areas in Mexico, there has been a 17% reduction in the tree's ecological dominance.
And the pressure doesn't just come from poachers. We have reports from the Friends of Ironwood Forest, the organization that manages the National Monument in Arizona.
Right.
And to be super clear here, we are looking at this strictly through the lens of ecological impact on the soil and the flora. We are not delving into the politics of border policy or the Second Amendment or anything like that. We're just looking at the physical reality on the ground as documented.
The physical reality is one of severe habitat disruption.
Exactly. The conservationists note that the monument faces heavy damage from intense human traffic. This includes the foot traffic of undocumented migrants navigating the remote desert, leaving behind massive amounts of trash, plastic water bottles, and forging new trails that crush the fragile cryptobiotic soil crusts.
The cryptobiotic crusts are vital. That's the living layer of fungi and cyanobacteria that literally holds the desert floor together.
And once that crust is broken,
Erosion accelerates dramatically, making it nearly impossible for new ironwood seedlings to establish themselves.
simultaneously the area suffers heavy impact from recreational target shooters. Conservation teams regularly have to haul out thousands of pounds of brass casings, lead, and discarded appliances used as targets.
There are even documented instances of shooters literally blasting ancient saguaros and old-growth ironwood trees to pieces.
The sheer volume of human activity from all sides is battering an ecosystem that relies on absolute stability to survive.
It really is death by a thousand cuts. Habitat fragmentation, the sprawl of cities like Phoenix and Tucson, illegal harvesting, recreational damage, they all push the ecosystem toward a tipping point.
But even all of those combined pale in comparison to the ultimate threat facing the ironwood,
The final catastrophic threat to the Sonoran Desert.
bufflegrass.
Pennisetum ciliare. It is arguably the most dangerous invasive species currently active in the American Southwest.
Which is funny because bufflegrass sounds completely benign. It sounds like something you'd plant in a suburban lawn, but its presence here is an ecological time bomb.
It is. And to understand why, we have to understand the mechanics of fire in the desert.
Break that down for us.
Well, bufflegrass is native to the African savannas. The savanna is an ecosystem that evolved with fire. Grasses burn, the ash returns nutrients to the soil, and the deep roots survive to sprout again. The flora there is built to burn.
But the Sonoran Desert is the exact opposite. It is not fire adapted.
Right, because historically, the desert doesn't have the fuel to sustain a fire. If you look at a healthy native desert landscape, the plants, the saguaros, the ironwoods, the creosote bushes, they are all spaced far apart from one another.
They are separated by wide stretches of bare dirt, rocks, and that biological soil crust.
They space themselves out naturally to avoid competing for the microscopic amounts of water in the soil.
And that spacing is their natural defense against fire.
Exactly. If a dry lightning strike ignites a native creosote bush, that single bush will burn intensely, but the fire has nowhere to go. It hits the bare dirt and extinguishes. There is no continuous fuel to carry the fire across the landscape.
But bufflegrass entirely rewrites those physical rules.
It operates as a continuous fuse. Bufflegrass is an incredibly aggressive colonizer. It takes root in all those barren, rocky spaces between the native plants.
Just filling in the gaps.
And it spreads exponentially, capable of doubling its population mass every single year. It creates a continuous, unbroken carpet of dense, highly flammable biomass across the previously bare desert floor.
It bridges the gaps. It connects the isolated native plants into one massive fuel grid.
Yeah.
And when a spark hits that grid, whether it's lightning, a dragging trailer chain on a highway, or a tossed cigarette, the result isn't just a fire.
It is an inferno. The thermal output is devastating. Bufflegrass fuels fires that burn at temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit.
1,400 degrees. That is hot enough to melt aluminum. And the native plants have absolutely no evolutionary defense against that kind of thermal shock.
None at all.
I mean, the giant saguaro cacti, which are essentially massive towers of stored water, literally boil. The water inside them turns to steam, rupturing their internal structures, and they just melt from the inside out.
And the indestructible ironwood trees, the fortresses that can stand dead for 1,600 years without rotting, they are entirely incinerated. The extreme heat of the bufflegrass fire penetrates the dense wood, cooking the cambium layer and killing the ancient trees.
And here is the truly insidious part of this biological trap. The 1,400-degree fire annihilates the ironwoods. It melts the saguaros. It kills the tortoises.
But it doesn't kill the bufflegrass.
Because the bufflegrass wants to burn.
Yes. Its critical biomass, its root crown, is insulated safely underground. Once the fire sweeps through and destroys the ancient canopy of the desert, the bufflegrass simply resprouts from its surviving roots.
And now all of its native competition has been burned to ash.
The shade is gone.
The ironwoods are gone, so the bufflegrass comes back even more vigorously than before. It creates a vicious, self-perpetuating feedback loop that rapidly converts a highly diverse, ancient, complex desert ecosystem into a barren, single-species grassland of African bufflegrass.
It is a stark demonstration of how fragile evolutionary specialization truly is. The ironwood is a masterclass in adaptation. It perfectly solved the riddle of the Sonoran Desert.
Right.
But it is not adapted to the rules of the African savanna. When human activity, global shipping, agricultural introduction, suddenly drops the rules of the savanna directly into the desert, the ironwood is left entirely defenseless.
Think about the tragic irony of that. You have an organism that spent millions of years evolving to defeat the harshest conditions on the planet. It defeated crushing drought by agonizingly slowing its own growth.
It defeated rot and insects by packing its cells with toxic oils.
It defeated hungry herbivores by filling its seeds with chemical imposters. It built itself into a 1,600-year-old armored bunker. And it is entirely undone by an invasive blade of grass that uses fire as a weapon.
All of that brilliant evolutionary armor means absolutely nothing when the ground beneath you is burning at 1,400 degrees.
It is a sobering reality that really challenges our assumptions about permanence in nature. Let's take a breath and guide you through a quick recap of the incredible ground we've covered today.
It's been quite a journey.
We started with a piece of wood so dense it defies physics, sinking in water and shattering steel. We broke down the mechanics of how this armored, toxic hermit actually serves as the beating heart of a fragile ecosystem, nursing giant cacti and stabilizing temperatures for hundreds of animal species.
Then we explore the deep history of the Comcaac.
Right, an unconquered people who use thermal chemistry to turn the tree's toxic seeds into survival food. We watched the tragic shift as their sacred, hand-scraped craft was co-opted by industrial power saws that literally poisoned the workers. And finally, we face the devastating reality of a continuous biological fuse melting a landscape that took millennia to build.
If there's a central takeaway from this exploration, it is the profound interconnectedness of knowledge. You cannot truly understand the desert ironwood by solely examining its botany.
No, not at all.
To grasp the reality of this organism, you must view it through the lens of cellular physics, indigenous anthropology, Spanish colonial economics, modern respiratory health, and global fire ecology. Every element is inextricably linked.
The survival of the desert tortoise relies on the density of the wood,
Which is a reaction to the lack of rainfall,
which is currently threatened by a grass from Africa.
which was brought here by human globalization.
It is a brilliant reminder to look for the invisible threads connecting everything around us. And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over on your commute or your walk or wherever you are listening right now. The desert ironwood is the ultimate symbol of extreme resilience. It adapted to drought, heat, and time with absolute perfection.
But as human globalization introduces totally alien threats, like electric power saws that aerosolize its toxic defenses, or fire-loving grasses that rewrite the thermal limits of the desert,
We have to look at this ancient sinking wood and ask ourselves a very difficult question. What does resilience even mean when the fundamental rules of the ecosystem you mastered can be completely rewritten in a single generation?